Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. I'm here with my good buddy, Hugh Hendry. And he just had an incredible conversation with Lacey Hunt. And I want to get into that. But before we do, Hugh, it's been probably, a year and a half since we've had the chance to talk. So I know you're one of the foremost thinkers in macro, and you're always outside of the box, which is great. So what's your worldview right now? What are you thinking about? What do you think is most important?
The most important thing continues to be the professional investment community's obsession with the bald, blind rats of the central banking community. That the perception of omnipotence that is placed upon the central banking community fascinates me, and obviously I don't believe it's warranted, and it's a profound curiosity to me, because here are these supposedly very smart people, like, listening out to every word in these dot patterns and whatever to a community that's always wrong. It's always wrong. It's always doing damage to the greater good. So we're in a cycle just now where the Federal Reserve is in its ascendancy. And when the Federal Reserve is in its ascendancy, bad things happen. Bad things happen.
Hugh, when did you first get into this business?
The business
of just analyzing macro, and as a hedge fund manager, I'm sure you're doing it prior to setting up your own fund. But when did you really start paying attention to markets?
Heavens. I mean, wow, Josh. I mean, when did I not? But I mean, if you wanted like the very first sensation, I was at university, and in my fourth honors year, I was offered. This is desperately dull. I mean, if there are kids watching this, go to university and learn English literature. English literature, to my mind, is the most powerful subject you could take on. Don't study something relevant. I studied relevant topics, but I was coming from, no one in my community had ever been to university. My father was a truck driver, blah blah blah, right? So I was kind of trying to reach out of that particular pond. And so, I was studying accountancy and economics, So that's not the path. That is not the path. However, to answer your question,
was this late 80s or early 90s?
Yeah, late 80s.
So how important was the Fed back then, and how has it changed?
Well, it wasn't, but the late 80s, I had this encounter with a data stream terminal, and I had a kind of dissertation to try and determine if markets could determine between right and wrong, between like a null hypothesis of we're changing an accounting policy and it should have no bearing on the overall valuation of a business. The overall valuation would be determined by changes in recurring cash flow. Okay, and so I was given a methodology to try to watch markets, and a bit like the Tempest, like you don't know what's going to happen. And it's, back then it was black screens with little green dots. And then this cluster of green dots would reveal the market mind. So it was the revelation that the market could expose itself. Boy, that was a seed that was planted a very, very long time ago.
But did the market hang on just every single word the Fed says back then, like they do now?
I imagine so, but I would say back then it would have had more relevancy. The interview that I think you were mentioning with the wonderful Lacey Hunt, right?
Yeah.
The thrust and perhaps of if we had a disagreement, it was if we go back to the decade of the 1970s and the which began really with the Eurodollar system coming to the fore, but from its infancy and through that decade, it just became bigger and more relevant. But I want to say that the purvey the kingdom that the Federal Reserve surveys, and remember, it surveys first and foremost as a banking regulator.
Right.
This is a banking regulator.
Domestic, by the way.
Domestic banking regulator. And then I also want to kind of have a play on words. It surveys the creation of sovereign dollars.
Right. That was a good way to say it. When you said that to Lacey, I thought to myself, Hugh's articulating that in a way that's a lot easier for most people to understand.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is, but the Eurodollar system was a means of creating non-sovereign dollars, which is to say dollars that were being created out with the sovereignty of the United States, out with the frontier of the United States. And so, again, in terms of relevancy, the Fed would have been desperately relevant in the 60s and the early 70s because it has an obsession with sovereign dollar creation. And maybe back then that would represent perhaps 80% of all dollar creation. Therefore, the Fed and its observations would be highly relevant. Today, here we are 40, 50 years later, the problem that I believe the Fed has is that what it's watching is maybe no more than 20% of dollar creation, okay? And it's aware of something else, but it's very resistant to like no one's asked it to widen its domain. And if you will, it's shuttered. And the conversation with Lacey I found frustrating because he comes from within that system and they just shutter. They're just like, we're going to be experts on this domain and to heck with everything else. Well, in saying to heck with everything else, we're falling into, like Einstein, we keep making the same mistakes. Once you do that once, twice, three times, then you're getting closer to insanity. So that's where I begin to kind of buckle.
I think his pushback there was what you're talking about definitely exists, the Eurodollar market, and there are trillions of dollars that are created outside of the United States in this banking system that the Fed doesn't control, doesn't monitor, and really can't quantify. But if you're talking just about the domestic economy, even if they're dollars that are created outside the states, that's going to get picked up in the velocity. And what he was talking about there is basically M2 money supply and GDP. And so because if you have those dollars that are being created, they're going to come back into the United States, they're going to circulate. And therefore, if you're just trying to figure out what's going to happen in the US economy, if you still have the metrics of GDP, nominal GDP, M2 money supply, and therefore velocity, it picks up any of that activity outside of the United States that's relevant to the domestic economy.
I reject that, George.
So that's why that's what I want to hear your views on.
Yeah. Because, so in the late 70s, with Thatcher and Reagan and with their policy advisors, there was a thrust we brought to the fore the measurement of money, the M2 statistics. And there was a notion that was established that if we could control the money supply, if the money supply could be controlled to a growth rate in line with nominal GDP, then it wouldn't leave much scope for inflation. And, think of the analogy of a wallet. And we know the outgoings of the personal household sector. Yeah. And therefore, M2 was really an examination of how much money was flowing into the wallet, because we know what's committed to flow out. And with the advent, if we take it in today's world where suddenly prices are rising at, let's say, 10%. Well, if you could control money, this M2 notion, and you could control that to 6, if the rate of money growth is 6, but prices are rising at 10, then you would cause a reduction in discretionary expenditure. You would cause the economic agents in the economy to have to choose between one or the other. And therefore, you would take the ammunition away, the ammunition that feeds persistent and permanent price rises of 10%. So you go to the source, but they could not succeed. Like their models consistently failed. Their observations of M2, their efforts to direct and to influence M2. And then as they looked further out in terms of what happened to GDP, what happened to inflation, it was a failure. And thankfully, they've been candid about that, and they stopped doing M2 targeting. They said it doesn't work. Now, why does it not work? It doesn't work because of the huge elephant outside the US economy. Now,
Right.
that dollar circulation, which is created in the banking sectors of London, Paris, into Asia, Japan and Tokyo is a huge area. It doesn't necessarily swing back into the US, because remember, oil. If you're buying oil, you're buying a Chinese manufacturer. Let's say has to buy oil. It's buying it in dollars. It needs dollars to concentrate that. Those dollars don't necessarily have to flow back. If you wanted to measure it, then it's a bit like the wind. You can feel it, but you don't see it. You can feel it, and you can see its influence on something else, like a tree. And so the dollar creation, especially over the last 15 years, the dollar creation has been very evident in asset price inflation as opposed to general price inflation. But it's there, and I have a dismay for the lack of curiosity. I mean, and again, you say we can't measure it. I mean, the Bank for International Settlements, was it 2 weeks ago, kind of revealed that there's $80 trillion of commitments, and they don't sit on, like when you read the accounts, it's a note to the account.
Right.
So, but they are regulators, and like, just bring it onto the accounts and measure it. It's not
What was Lacey's, was his point that you couldn't quantify, or that you couldn't control M2? Because I think what you're saying is that the Fed, there's no way the Fed can control M2. But I don't know that he was saying control, but more quantify, or was he saying control?
Well, again, so he was saying two things. He was citing the work of Irving Fisher.
Yeah.
Now my problem, and again with Irving Fisher, is it's your MV equals PT or whatever. It's the monetary creation being this huge determinant of GDP.
Yeah. And he's talking about Friedman too, and that's where you start talking about velocity. Yeah.
But he's talking about dead economists. Like, why are there no living economists? The Fisher book was in the 1930s. It was before subsequent revolutions in monetary transmission. And so it just seems to get this sticker. I mean, I switch off with M2. I switch off with the abstraction, which is velocity. It's like we can't measure this thing. We're going to call it velocity. But that's just a cop out. Like, because again, velocity has this bizarre. I mean, it's a bit like, what did the Romans ever do for us? When has velocity ever explained anything relevant to you in the world of investment?
Yeah. I've been doing a lot of research on the 1800s, and holy cow, you want to talk about velocity? You want to talk about velocity volatility? I mean, it is absolutely all over the place. Do you think real GDP is a valuable measurement?
I think
so what does it measure?
Real GDP, if the US economy is growing at 8%, let's start with that be 8. Well, so the US economy is not set up to grow at 8%. Unless there is some revolution in how we configure the workplace, unless there is another revolution in money, unless there's a revolution which reveals more or extracts more productivity from the limited resources at the disposal of the United States. The US is not set up to grow at 8%. If it is growing at 8%, then it is on stimulants, and they are monetary stimulants. So the presence of growth rates greater than, say, 6 nominal would reveal the stimulants, artificial stimulants,
right,
very bullish economic agents.
But would you say that an economy that has a higher real GDP, so the nominal GDP adjusted for inflation, is performing better, is creating more economic output, is increasing the standard of living in general more than a country who has a lower real GDP. Like, let's just say your real GDP was flat for an entire decade, right? But then you got another country that's growing at 8% nominal,
Yeah.
but 6% real because they got a 2% inflation rate. Would you assume that the country that was growing at the 6% real, their standard of living and their economic output as a whole would be increasing at that level, or yes, no, it's tough to tell?
I don't think they're comparable. Um, you're describing the recent experience, if we go back the last 20, 30 years between the US and the Chinese economy. Okay. But that just reflects that, China had removed itself from, the world of economics until 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah,
And so it
right,
was
right, right.
engaging, it was by coming in late and beginning to configure its assets and resources and to make smart, intelligent decisions. It was creating a rate of economic growth greater than the US, which had been exploiting them for much longer.
Mm,
I have a chap who's come in and who's come in with a hammer, and you know what they say: to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. He's like, dun, dun, dun.
right.
But yeah, no, I don't think that's. And you won't find there are no. I mean, I can't even imagine that two economies within Europe, let's say, right? So Europe is a union of independent sovereigns. They all have, France has its growth rate, Germany has its growth rate. And I can't imagine suddenly France is going to start growing at, 8 nominal with 2 inflation and 6 real, and Germany is going to be growing at 10 nominal with 1 inflation and 9 real. That's kind of that's cooked in now.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I realize it's tougher for them. I'm just trying to. I was just the other day. I was trying to think through how well real GDP reflects how well the actual economy is doing.
Okay, well, let's do it differently. Okay, so the convention is that we measure all of the expenditure, all of the incomes, all of the output, the 3 measures of GDP, and we start with an absolute figure,
Yep.
and then we come in and we handicap it. We handicap it for inflation.
Yep.
Okay. My point is, well, if you accept the need to recalibrate the nominal expenditure and you start with the change in prices, why stop there? Okay. Why wouldn't you come in with further elaboration? So what if GDP grows at, let's keep these numbers relevant. What if GDP in the US is growing at 4%, okay? But total debt to GDP expanded by 50% over the course of the year. It went from 300% to 350. Like, would it not make more sense as a policymaker to actually then to take the increase in debt out of the equation, the amplification that comes from the debt rise?
Right.
We take the amplification of prices out of it to get Shouldn't we have real with flat nominal GDP to get at the essence of the fruits of all the productivity and creativity of the entrepreneurial sector within the US? Why do we not do that? I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, and in not doing that, and so there's an experiment. I think it's New Zealand just now, which is it's seeking to control house prices. I don't know if it's using the rise in house prices as a controlling mechanism, but that would be an example. If the stock market and house prices in a year grew by 15% versus the previous year, that would be a kind of warning that's abnormal. That kind of, you should have a kind of linear GDP growth rate of, like, we did have linear kind of GDP growth rate with cyclicality, but around a cyclical trend around a linear line of about almost 3% GDP growth in the 30, 35 years up until 2007.
Yeah.
Now, if the stock market is up 20% in a year versus that trend, that's a bit of a head scratcher. You should be curious and say, what has changed? A bit like me when I was doing my market-based accounting research, and I was like, let's test hypothesis here. We know what the null hypothesis is: the stock market should be measuring wealth creation, and that should be tethered to this long-term rate of growth. And if the stock market is appreciated, or if wealth has appreciated by 5x what is the normal wealth of 3, then let's do further examination, because we could be building vulnerability.
Yeah.
And we don't. And so again, we don't do that. We start talking about velocity. We start quoting dead economists. So I'm aggrieved, because that long-term growth rate of 2.7, let's say, since the great financial crisis brought on 2008, 2009, that growth rate has halved. And that halving is cumulatively creating trillions of dollars of lost income, right?
Well,
and income, very important, very precious.
Standard of living.
Yeah. And there are many reasons for that, but one of the reasons I would cite is that we have had at least three interventions on the part of the Federal Reserve since then. We had the famous taper tantrum, which was, I want to say, forgive me,
It's 2018, wasn't it?
No, the taper tantrum was 2013 or thereabouts, and where Bernanke went, the economy seems to be a little bit stronger. We might have to think about the size of our balance sheet and perhaps tapering it. And then the market went, oh, holy cow, right? If these idiots are worried about the situation, maybe we should worry. And we went, the 10-year doubled. It went to 3% back in 2013. So the private sector came in before the Federal Reserve and tightened policy, right? Why? Adult unemployment was like 7.5%. GDP was was improving, but we came in and we doubled 10-year rates. Okay. So that was a kind of, I wish that hadn't happened. The Fed didn't actually get to raise rates because the market had done it. But in doing so, the economy then kind of hit a modest metaphorical wall and decelerated. So again, we need this escape velocity to enrich all of the franchise, as opposed to just the asset owning franchise, for the economy at large. It didn't happen then. Janet Yellen came in. Janet, I always think of Janet as being scholarly and kind of like a school teacher and a little bit timid. But she's like, well, I think we might have to actually. Then she was the first actually to raise rates, but it was like 25 basis points. You never really felt that her heart was in it, and that was 2015. And then that dissipated, but it was a tightening. And then we had the advent of Jay. Jay's like, I'm just determined to be Paul Volcker. And he started meddling in 2018. We had a 20% correction in the stock market. China really wobbled. And then Jay was like, oh, bugger, and he took it back. Before then COVID then released the Volcker within him again. So those 3 going on 4 altercations on the part of the Federal Reserve, I think, are one of the dominant forces for why the trend growth rate in US GDP is half what it was previously.
Do you think it's possible for an economy to hit that escape velocity you're referring to if federal spending as a percentage of GDP is call it 40-50%? So you've only got 50% of that GDP accounted for by the private sector, those entrepreneurs you're referring to. Yeah. It would seem like it's almost impossible compared to a time, when let's say government spending as a percentage of GDP was 10%.
Yeah. So I think again, I prefer storytelling to crunching numbers on spreadsheets, and the Federal Reserve seems to prefer models and kind of linear thinking. Right. And policymakers are trapped there. And so there's a logical argument that, hey, look, and this is what China does. If we just spend more, because China's been operating on a GDP calculator, and it's like, okay, we want 5% real GDP. Okay, what do you got? And it's like, well, let's spend $1 trillion expanding infrastructure. Brilliant, genius. Let's spend another $1 trillion with property expansion. Genius. Okay, and you put that all in, and typically, boom, you get 5% GDP growth, and everyone is amazed.
They ignore the debt, though.
They ignore the debt, but I tell you who's not amazed. again, financial markets, the stock market is trying to actually capture wealth creation. And the lie in the GDP calculator and the lie with behind that, which is that if you just have more, if you have an accelerating trend in absolute expenditure, even by just one community of the economy, the government, right? Then you have, for sure, you can create GDP growth, but what you'll find is you'll find at best a long-term flat progression in stock markets. You know, Chinese wealth assets have not appreciated. I mean, they're being cyclical highs, but the mean has been zero because the GDP adventures of our Chinese friends has been at the expense of wealth creation.
Yeah.
Now, if we take that into the US, and Keynes gets such a hard time, and I'm not here to bash Keynes. I think he was an absolute genius. But the lie, if you're in a recession and the government comes in, and it should come in, it should come in with economic transfers to smooth the plight of those who've lost their jobs and stuff, And I think largely what they did with COVID and paying checks, because if you were telling people how to control their daily life, you had to compensate them when they couldn't earn a living.
Right.
I have no complaint with that. But when you come in and you are just the metaphorical digging holes and pouring money in, which is to say, if government expenditure is rising as a percentage of GDP, the entrepreneurs are like, yeah, I don't trust it. Entrepreneurs want to see other entrepreneurs spending money. It's that neighborly envy. It's like the plant next door is expanding and he's in the same industry, but you're not. And you're like, what does he know? What does she know that I don't know? And then you want to, is it as a market advantage? So it's,
or if the government's doing it, you're probably thinking the opposite. That's probably a stupid move.
Well, take the example of Europe just now, where obviously there's this profound energy crisis, and all the various governments have come in with public sector subsidies and attempt intervention, but manufacturers, they don't go, oh wow, I really feel more bullish about the future because the German government has just done a transfer subsidy of half a trillion dollars. It doesn't make you want to expand your business. It just is right. Like so we what, I don't know.
What do you think a concrete example would be? And I've tried to think of this. It's not easy, but a concrete example of how the Eurodollar system would impact the United States economy directly.
Okay. Well, I believe that the inflation of the 1970s was actually a function of the Eurodollar system.
But you could measure that in M2, right? Because those dollars coming back into the United States. No, you couldn't.
This is my point. They were sitting there and they had to. So China's got a GDP calculator. I'm going to keep with the calculator metaphor. Back in the 70s, policymakers had an M2 calculator. Mm-hmm. And on the show with Lacey, we see the variation in M2 over the last 30, 40 years. And it has very little relationship with inflation, which again is why they gave up. They got the M2 calculator by about 1982, 83 and went boom, threw it in the bin. Why did the M2 calculator not work? It didn't work because of the presence of non-sovereign dollar creation. Now, why was the non-sovereign dollar creation? Because
I understand that, but I'm trying. What I struggle with is how the non-sovereign dollar creation would impact the price of goods within the domestic economy. I get it if it's captured in M2, because that would mean those dollars that were created offshore are coming into a U.S. bank and therefore let's say a checking account, and then that can go out and buy a car. But where I struggle is just trying to figure out how those offshore dollars would chase goods inside the United States without being captured within M2, because I get it that they couldn't be captured from a standpoint of being off balance sheet. Maybe they're in the shadows. Maybe JP Morgan has $1 trillion in off balance sheet dollars that were created in the Eurodollar system that's off balance sheet. But then how does that get into the real economy?
Okay,
See
so
what I'm struggling with?
you want to touch and feel things, whereas I'm a kind of win guy, right? I'm an existentialist. Okay, so let's try and answer this. The effective monetary policy engagement is a game of psychology. In the 1970s,
Okay.
think of a bank as a hedge fund that has only two assets. It can lend to the government, which is to say it can own 10-year treasuries, or it can lend to the household and corporate sector.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
One is kind of real and one is nominal. Okay. And when Volcker stepped into the breach, if you looked at the cumulative hedge fund of the banking, the US domestic banking sector, they had the asset switch was very, very heavily in favor of making real loans to the private sector.
And this was in the 70s?
This is the 70s.
Okay,
and
got
so,
it.
And remember, Volcker comes in and he says, okay, two things. My predecessors have been lying to you. You know when they said there was no inflation? There was a lot of inflation. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, that's the bad news. The good news is there's a new sheriff in town. Ka-ching, 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 and I'm going to fix it. Okay,
Right.
so the new sheriff sits down and he's at a table, and he's surrounded by the bankers, and he's got his cards, and they've got their cards. So Volcker knows what they're looking at is they're like, yeah. You didn't fool us with that. There's no inflation. Our asset allocation, we own real assets. We've been lending to the real economy, and we've got variable rates, and we'll be okay. And Volcker sat down and is like, okay, for me to succeed, I need to change your asset allocation. I need to stop. I have to impact the fervor. I have to impact your enthusiasm for making new loans to the private sector. So I'm saying to you, the banking community, their macro goggles are like, there is inflation, okay? And we can only do things, invest nominally or invest in real assets. Clearly, we're investing in real assets, okay? And if they're investing in real assets and they've got a desire to do more and more, then if we think of that as M2, which is relevant because we're talking about the domestic monetary banking community, then back to my wallet, we know that prices are accelerating 10%. Okay, and we're trying to control the money coming in. M2 is the money coming into the wallet. Okay, and we want that to be less than the official inflation rate. The more that we can make the monetary creation less than the desire of prices to expand, then the more we can put a depressant. The more that we can remove the fuel which sustains the price trend. Okay, so Volcker sits down. He's like, I'm crazy. They're like, what? He's like, I'm crazy. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? And he says, you know, the first oil shock, you know how devastating that was to the US economy. It was the steepest, deepest contraction since the Second World War. And they're like, yeah. He's like, well, and you know that we're having another oil price shock. And they're like, yeah, it's not good. He's like, imagine I raised interest rates in not just a recession, but a really, really, really bad recession. Like, you wouldn't do that. He's like, you're not listening. I'm crazy. I'm like, really? So then they're looking at their cards going, is he really? He's because he's saying, I'm going to raise rates. Okay. So remember, they may have elected to have real assets, but they were real assets that came with commercial risk.
Right.
Saying, I'm going to raise the ante. You're going to see so much commercial failure as I raise rates. Are you sure you want to own these real assets and not 10-year? I've got to dispersuade you to stop creating domestic sovereign dollars. And so that conversation went on a bit, and then the bank's like, Jesus, this guy really is crazy because boom, 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 he raised rates. Okay. Now, initially, that wasn't a success, and we had a persistent elevation, and ultimately the Fed had to go to 20%, as you know, in 1982. Why? Because in the offshore sector, there was this new banking transmission mechanism where you didn't require onshore, you need 8% capital to support your credit expansion. Offshore's like nothing.
Zero.
Zero. You need the goodwill of your counterparty. You
Correct.
need the faith and
Correct.
the confidence of your counterparty.
Correct.
And so
That's it. That's it.
that's all it is. And so all of this money's coming in. I don't have to put anything against it. This is high up. This is like ROI stuff. This is you've dreamt about this. Now it's a reality. And so they are lending. They're like, okay, what do we do? They're lending to Brazil. So and there's this incredible Brazil, which people forget. Brazil, before China, there was Japan. Before Japan, there was kind of Russia, and within the melee, because Russia was there for like 30 years or whatever, which apparently was an economic miracle. And within that, in the 1970s, Brazil was an amazing miracle. A lot of the petrodollars principally went into Brazil and satellites in the American states. And so it was booming. And so the overseas sector was like, the US is a bit cranky. They've got that crazy Fed guys raising rates. Oil prices are very high. But we're taking all these dollars and we're expanding in the rest of the world. And so then domestic enterprises in the US were like, wow, well, we're going to expand in the overseas sector. And so the presence and the scale, the magnitude of the Eurodollar system, and it's the fact that it wasn't being measured, I think led to the extremes in interest rates. And then even extreme, remember what I wanted to say.
So the impact was more psychological.
It's always psychological. It's always psychological. And so if we take that to today, the Fed's coming in and like beating up the domestic banks. And the domestic banks are like, get off my case. I ain't your problem. I am not the problem. Okay. If you look at
this is not the 1970s.
Domestic bank dollar creation roughly has been running at like 4% per annum. That ain't underwriting 10% price increases. Okay. Coming from somewhere else. Where did it come from? It's this transitory, temporary supply shock brought on by the enormity of COVID, right? And all those checks sent by the Treasury encouraging people to spend when we'd closed down the damn manufacturing sector. So, prices, the integrity of prices, we've got a supply demand imbalance. What do? We raise prices, until the demand comes down. Okay. We did that, right? We, as you know, freight prices went zoom. They've now fallen 90%. This happened after the Second World Wars. The same thing is happening now, except the Fed's coming in and clobbering the domestic banks. And they're like, the only inflation that has existed in the last 15 years has been asset price inflation. Okay. And that asset price inflation has been funded by the Eurodollar sector. You're not getting money at the credit window from the Eurodollar system to expand, to help an Ohio-based manufacturer double its manufacturing capacity. You're doing that to give money to a hedge fund or a private equity to do another trade. Now, with the Fed, my problem is that asset price inflation being created out of the Eurodollar system, they're gone. They're not doing it. They're not doing it with the intensity. I can say that very emphatically because I can see asset prices. The asset price contraction. I think we've lost about 200% of GDP. And imagine we were actually we were marking to market the true value of private equity, which is still fantasy. It's still not being recorded. So that's pulling back. Why is the Eurodollar system, independently of the Federal Reserve, is having an enormous bout of regret? So the Eurodollar system stands or falls on the strength and the veracity of the collateral that it accepts as it creates non-sovereign dollars. And the Eurodollar system is like, damn, we got too bullish again, right? So the cycle 2005, 2004, 5, 6, 7, right? Was we get inflation when the Eurodollar system begins to accept and take risk with the collateral that it's willing to hold. Okay. And so what happened in the genius, whatever, of the financial sector is it created the mortgage-backed security. The conceit and arrogance of a good idea. It's like mortgages are a solid risk asset because, by and large, no one wants to default on their home loan, right? You're going to do everything to avoid that. So that makes it a less risky asset class, okay? And then you say, well, but house prices across the 50-odd states of the US have never all fallen at the same time. So if we combine geography with this very safe asset, we've created a collateral which arguably is less risky than a US 10-year.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know what Jim Grant says on that, Hugh? He says Wall Street is fantastic at taking a good idea and turning it into a really bad idea.
Yeah, but Wall Street's a drug dealer, right? Wall Street's there to take you higher, right? To take asset prices higher, right? Because it clips, it takes a percentage commission. So Wall Street, there was $5 trillion of money coming into the US in the early stages of the noughties, from China, from Germany, from all the mercantilist nations, all the overseas private sector savings funds. They wanted to buy dollar assets, and at a particular level, they want to buy safe, secure, sovereign dollar, treasury dollar assets. And so there was a great missed opportunity where the Federal Reserve, I believe, not the Federal Reserve, the Treasury and the US government should have went on a spending binge and created lots of treasuries, because there was $5 trillion coming in, and that's exactly what they wanted. But the net treasury issuance was 1.5. So there's 5 coming in, we give them 1.5. And to James Grant's point, it's like, well, so Wall Street goes, there's 3.5 trillion latent expenditure, like people want to buy. Let's create something. And you created mortgage-backed securities. And at that point, the most important thing is getting collateral, getting them, once you've done the MBS, and you go to the lending window in the Eurodollar, says, hey, I've got $1 billion of MBS. Will you create dollars? Will you create $1 billion of non-sovereign dollars? And I'm like, yeah, sure. This stuff is dope. This stuff is like really secure, until it's not, right? Until 2007 and 2008. And we have, the black swan. There's one observation, which is prices fall uniformly across the US, and exposes that the collateral has been mispledged, that it's actually very, very risky. Okay. And so all of the credit expansion has to be rapidly unwound. That's monetary. That's like trying to control M2. It's like, guys, we operate 24 hours. Okay. And tomorrow, the MBS, I want 10-year treasuries. Okay. Yeah. Merde. So you got to go out and you got to sell the mortgage-backed securities. And The same thing has just happened after the Lacey Hunt interview. I interviewed Kyle Davies, who ran the Three Arrows. He calls it a hedge fund. I don't know why. He just, the Three Arrows, a crypto, profoundly speculative fund. Okay, and it's the same thing. And the whole Sam Beckman thing is exactly the same thing. This is where you create collateral. So all of these lending credit facilitators are there, and they're telling a story about, I can give you exposure to the world of crypto, and they're getting private equity valuations of $30 billion. And to support $30 billion, you got to be growing. You've got to be expanding credit. So you really, again, remember the housing market in 2002, you want a mortgage, and the bank says, well, I want 30% equity. You're like, oh, okay. By 2007, you're going to the bank. You're like, I'm having an affair. I'm just out of prison. I've got a drug problem. I've got a criminal record. They're like, would you shut up? Just take the damn money, right? Just got through that cycle and so this Kyle Davies, he just milked. He had no external investors. He got his funding from credit providers, and credit providers just had to show to their investors that they were lending into crypto. And so allegedly someone like SBF, these stable coins.
It's FTT coins. Yeah.
Well, remember it's a bit like what we saw in the IPOs. You issue less than 10% of the outstanding. It trades on your exchange, and oops, I put a big order in, and the price has now gone up, and suddenly the market capitalization of the entire unissued coinage is 60 billion.
Yeah.
And you go to the window and you say, how many dollars would you give me for my stable coin? They're like, how much? You got 60 billion? Yeah, we'll give you 60 billion. Wow, amazing. Then you go and you buy it again, and you get the asset price inflation until at some point it's exposed as an untruth or something else. These were the presence of the Eurodollar system and imaginative financiers creating forms of must-have collateral, which then releases these non-sovereign dollar floods of non-sovereign dollars, is why we're getting these massive is why we're getting asset price inflation and then these periodic, very, very sharp contractions when the collateral is exposed as being not pristine. The new monetary order is a collateral-based lending system, and sadly, that's not what the Federal Reserve is watching. And so, you asked me what's my dominant theme just now is I really think bad things are going to happen. So, and I like just now because there's a real double bluff coming out of hedge funds and Wall Street, and maybe they're right. Sometimes double bluff works, but with the good old Jesus of Jeff Snyder, that he's been at great lengths to explain that the only community that kind of that forecasts cycles is the curvature of
Eurodollar future curve or the bond market.
Yeah. And it's been signaling for 18 months is like, we're seeing everything, right? We're watching Eurodollars and we're watching the Federal Reserve, okay? And the totality of that makes us very, very concerned about economic growth and certainly makes us way more kind of like the inflation that you see just now. It's going to be a deflationary problem. So, those curves have been like, you're doing too much, you're doing too much, you're doing too much. And the Fed's like, they don't understand. Why don't they understand? Because they're watching everything. And because they're watching everything, they are 90% correct. Whereas the Fed is like, I'm going to give it 15% grudgingly. All right. So, but there's a big double bluff just now where hedge fund guys are like, this is the most predicted, like, sharp economic recession ever.
Yeah.
Thing that's so, what if the Treasury bond curvature has got it wrong? Yeah, well, what if? I mean, typically that's a 1 in 10 event. Typically 9 out of 10 times, it works. Now, I tell you another thing. I was in Miami 2 weeks ago, principally for the Art Basel. Art Basel, it should really be called Party Basel. And I don't know where the Basel comes from. But there was a lot of razzle, and I was having a splendidly entertaining time. But of course, there is an amazing gent who there are many amazing people, but Dave Zervos of Jefferies is resident there, and I bump into Dave, and Dave was a Fed. I don't know what Dave was, a Fed economist. He was a notable mind that originated out of the Federal Reserve community, and he now has a franchise trying to with his clients, trying to tell them, educate them with how the Fed thinks and stuff. And I bumped into him. I mean, normally I bump into him at 3:00 in the morning. He normally gets me into the bar that I can't get into. But I met him actually in the art fair, and he's like, "What are you doing tonight?" I'm like, "Well, lots of silly things." He said, "No, I'm hosting a dinner for these, like, the great and the good, money managers. Come and do your asset capitalism." And I did. I mean, unfortunately, I was when I walked into the room, and there was like these 15 austere gentlemen of finance, and I was kind of wearing a vest and a scarf and sunglasses. Both parties are like, I think the wrong door. Like, no, they've invited me, And I saw it and I was like, oh my God, I didn't see anything. And so I was like, tell us what you think. And I was like, I found it remarkable. They did not want to know about money. All they wanted to know about. Well,
Why? Why do you think that from a psychological standpoint, why, Hugh?
Well, back to the genesis of this conversation. Why does Lacey not want to talk about it? The Federal Reserve has done such an amazing propaganda job in persuading these very powerful money managers that the Fed controls it. So, imagine where we are just now. So the big thing is the Fed. Okay, it's no longer raising rates by 75. It's kind of doing 50. It's kind of slowing down a bit, but then it's still saying the terminal point is going to be higher than we thought. So our destiny is in the control of the Federal Reserve, right? And the Federal Reserve are through their great wisdom, they are going to select the appropriate moment, and they're going to time it to perfection, and then they're going to start cutting interest rates, and we're going to have a shallow recession. Okay. When has that ever happened? Never. Has never happened. The central premise of all these damn Wall Street guys is the Fed's going to get it perfect. I mean, blow me down, call me Shirley. I mean, what are they thinking? They're setting themselves up for disappointment. We have got blind economic agents who create this abstraction called velocity, who are determined just to look at 20% of all the creation of dollar, to ignore non-sovereign dollar creation, and they're going to get the right point to cut interest rates. I'm not buying it. But that's for other people to determine,
Yeah, but that makes a lot of sense, man.
Does it? I mean, that's not what people normally say when I stop talking.
No, it does. It absolutely makes a lot of sense. In fact, I wrote down several things that I'm going to actually have to think through on my own. It's almost like there's a Triffin's paradox with not necessarily the dollar, but with treasuries.
Did you say Triffin's paradox? Triffin's paradox,
yeah.
And again, allied to that is that the dollar is this extravagant, what's the term? It's an extravagant
privilege.
Yeah, extravagant privilege. I think it's an extravagant burden.
Yeah. Snyder said the same thing. I
think we're very close that within a decade, we will see a transformation in the monetary order, in the sense that, the late 20s saw the end of the gold standard. And we kind of don't know what really happened between the gold standard. It was Bretton Woods. But Bretton Woods was like neither here nor there. It was really the private sector kind of recirculated, and like Bretton Woods just didn't work, and so the private sector therefore had to come up with its own solution, which was Eurodollar, and it spent kind of 20 years, kind of the banks kind of trying to make it work. Took you into the 70s, and it really worked, and they went, wow, like we've had that conversation, and then the Eurodollar system took a fatal blow with the housing crash of 2007, 2008. And I think it's taking another blow. And it's we're going to have to reinvent. We won't be talking about, I don't think we'll be talking about the Eurodollar system as the principal agent, the principal monetary phenomenon. And we always talk about monetary phenomenon because we're always on our guard for inflation. Inflation is a monetary phenomenon. So again, if I backtrack, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Inflation is uppermost in people's minds. If I do a summary of this conversation, my angst is that in trying to examine and trying to control the monetary phenomenon, the Federal Reserve is looking at perhaps only 20% of the phenomenon. And I just wish that they would try harder. They would use their regulatory skill to force the banking sector to reveal more than just like little notes saying, oops, we have $80 trillion that you haven't asked us about, and so owing to this misalignment in terms of a desire to observe monetary phenomena versus the reality of what they're observing, then I think we get repeated policy errors.
And you think that's going to be the downfall?
It's going to be, I mean, let me give you a prophecy. The Federal Reserve will be cutting interest rates with its tail between its legs. It'll be cutting interest rates because when did you last cut interest rates? Because the stock market fell 20% in 2018. Okay, so this time around, they're like 20 doesn't move the needle. Okay, well, it's fine. They were they cut interest rates from 5.25 to 0 and the S&P dropped 55%. Okay, they never glide this thing to perfection, right? And the notion that the majority of risk assets just now, the 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 predominant function behind the status quo of today's prices is the Federal Reserve is going to nail this. Good luck with today's prices.
Yeah, right.
And let's find an economist who's alive. As Jeff shows, you don't have to be an economist. And I did a thing with Martin Armstrong last week. He calls himself an international economist. I was like, who would call himself an economist? That's the most discredited, discredited thing. Imagine
calling yourself a terrorist or something.
Bishop of the Catholic Church or something like, I'm more in favor of the people who go partying up Basel and elsewhere. Because the people at turning points actually see things. And of course, the conventional people are not willing to listen to the crazies, which is why they have a rapacious appetite for the Federal Reserve. If only we had a crazy person running the Federal Reserve.
Well said. Well said. All right, man. Great conversation. Tell us about the podcast. Tell us about the interviews. Tell us about what you're doing on social media.
I mean, George, I'm just hanging on just now, like I'm getting divorced, unfortunately. It was never planned. I spent like 4 months catastrophically with grief. And now I'm kind of released and I'm partying and I'm really finding out, I've stopped writing on Twitter. I will get it back together. I'm trying to get closure on this. The completion of another beautiful home in St. Bart's, a commercial home, a home to rent, another Blanc Bleu. It's over budget. It's late. I've got problems coming out of every orifice in my body just now. But thankfully, we have the Asset Capitalist, and every Friday we release another one, and it just keeps me sane. And the Asset Capitalist show is, I try my damnedest not to be part of the financial infrastructure or whatever, and yet it finds me, and I'm opinionated, and I can go head to toe with people and all they're doing all day is like talking on all this Fed nonsense and stuff, and so the Asset Capitalist is trying to kind of preach the gospel which is not taught in universities, the gospel the wisdom or the experience that I've accrued over the last 30 years in navigating turning points in markets. But it's hard, it's hard, but it's an endeavor, and it's a fun endeavor, and it's presently keeping me sane. So that's the Asset Capitalist podcast. We put it out on YouTube, and it's on all the audio platforms.
Great. I can't recommend it enough, and I think this conversation is a fantastic example as to why you need to tune in and hear what Hugh has to say, because obviously a brilliant guy, but his views are really outside the box. And I think especially going into a tumultuous decade, or maybe a tumultuous 2023, you've got to get outside the box and just consider all possibilities, and maybe try to be that crazy person that's able to see the turning point. And if you're stuck in this tunnel vision, you're not going to be able to see it coming.
No, well said.
So anyway, that's one of the main reasons to listen to my good buddy Hugh Hendry. Hugh, thanks for coming on, man. Sincerely appreciate the time, and I can't wait to get back to St. Bart's and hang out and see that overpriced property and do a little partying, my friend.
Yep, no, okay. I'm partied out.
All right, buddy. Have a good one.
Thank you, George.